Ever since the death of George Floyd, there has been a rising tension in America. People seem more angry than ever before, more separated by race, social class, economic earning. Why is that happening, and what could be done about it?
Let's see what the Bible says about that.
Something's changed in our nation over the last years, and it has this insidious feel to it. There's a general spirit of angst and distrust and animosity. I don't know about anybody else. I sense it when I just go out.
Yeah.
When at the store, there's just this sense of something's changed.
Yeah.
It's not like it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be this antagonism between social classes, between religions, between economic groups, between races, between states, between cities. Between gender, between sexual preferences, and even support for America. It's just, I tried to find some patriotic T-shirts over the past 3 or 4 months. They're just
kind of hard to find.
They're hard to find out there, and it's just, something's changed.
Yeah.
And I don't like it.
Yeah, exactly. There's not a feeling of unity when you go out. It's not a feeling of, like, man, we are all a part of this awesome country, and we all do this together, and we're all working toward this goal. And
right,
there's an increase in hate crimes. There's an increase in fighting. There's an increase in murder and abuse, domestic violence. All this, just brutal, painful things that happen in our society now. And
you feel like you just have to be on guard all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I know a lot of people who, of course, carry weapons and guns, and that's great. I love all that. But there's a whole lot more of it and a lot more need for it than there used to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a sense of, you're always watching. You look at every person, and it's hard to not fall into the thinking that every person is a potential threat.
And I think that's an interesting thing, like, because for me, that's now, we say that's over the last, say, 7 years or so. That's been kind of happening and has gotten more exponential over the last 4 or 5. I mean, that's the majority of my, like, adult self-independent life, And so to me, hearing you say, like, oh, yeah, it hasn't always been like that. I'm like, wow, that's kind of weird to me as someone who's almost 25, It's like, it feels like, wow, this is just always how things have been. Just everyone's kind of like, oh man, watch out for this, bro. Watch out for this. You could always get attacked or, beat up, condemned, whatever, wherever you go and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it hasn't always been that way.
No, I mean, there were certain places obviously certain parts of certain cities you went to that you felt that, but you could know, well, as soon as I leave that part of the city, I'm okay. But it's hard to find even those places anymore where you feel like, okay, I'm generally safe now. Even going to Walmart, I don't know that anyone feels that anymore.
For sure.
Whichever Walmart you go to.
For sure. Or again, as I'm around teens more often, people say that about going to school. Like literally you go to school and you're like, man, I hope we're safe today.
Yeah, true.
I hope nothing disastrous happens. I hope nothing tragic happens here. In even just the day-to-day life of teenagers, there's a general sense of, this person's talking about, I've got weapons and don't come to school this day and all this kind of stuff, like that's a different day and time to live,
Yeah, and then there's this general spirit of just cultural chaos, I think you could say. It's just like something's happening. It feels like the whole thing is just shaking. And, there's this movement and this feeling like everything that we've known is beginning to crumble.
Yeah.
And if you study political movements and philosophies and you study the scripture, you start to find that there is a label for all of this. There's a definition. There is something happening, and not everyone is defining it for what it is. Some are, and if you know what it is, you'll see it and you'll recognize it. I'm not crying, that there's. I'm not just conspiracy theorying here. This is reality.
Yeah.
And there's a philosophy, there's a movement called Marxism.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, you'll see that it's very much at play today. It's being taught on college campuses. It's being taught in social thought areas.
Which, like, in the 80s, that would have been like, it would have shocked the world if it was like, hey, in high school, we're teaching Marxism. And there's high school students.
No.
And there are college students who are going, well, Karl Marx didn't have that bad of ideas, which I've literally heard from people in their 20s.
Exactly. No, whoa. In the 80s, we're well aware of Russia, and we're fighting against the red flag and all of that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah, but Marxism, it is a radical social theory that focuses on the economic activity in a society. It is absent of a view of God. There is not one in it. It's absence of the value of the individual in the culture. It removes freedoms, and it has a view that increases tension between the classes of a nation in order so it can be rebuilt into something else. Especially if there's a democratic a democracy at play, then the forces that move toward Marxism are looking to burn it all down.
Yeah.
And so Marxism comes into play, and it has some tenets with it, some beliefs that I think we're seeing those today. And so they attempt to play up certain elements of the culture in attempt to burn it all down. And so what happens is, one, you find this class tension, this struggle between the classes. And so lies and storylines are fed to people to cause them to look at other parts of the society and have jealousy toward them, have anger toward them, and want what they have. And when you do this, you create distrust. And so that's happening. You find that in the culture. There's storylines being fed to distrust the 1%, those who make more money, the wealthy, the rich. They're taking control over everything. And then you find that in one race against another race. You find that in one religious group against another. You find that racially happening. You find this socially happening all across the level, where classes are being encouraged to rise up against other classes.
Yeah, and it's this idea of there's an oppressor, and then there is the oppressed, and the oppressed, they are the ones that the government really needs to rally behind, and they need to take over the oppressor. They need to overthrow the ones who are successful. They need to overthrow the ones who are the majority. They need to overthrow the ones who are strong, because they are oppressing this group of people.
Yep. And they feed that line.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it's encouraged. It's like, we need to really hype this up.
It's very much like the serpent in the garden. Has God really said, can you really trust that that government, that authority, that employer, all of that? It also features or focuses on this idea of economic idolatry, of viewing economy and money as the great shaper of all things. That is what we all should work toward. That if everyone had equal amounts of money, then it would really solve a lot of the issues. So you get this collective ownership element, you get this idolizing of money, and replacing capitalism and people with different socioeconomic groups, you replace that with everyone having all things in common. And you find then this other piece that has to happen where somebody has to be the distributor. Somebody has to be the one who takes notes. Someone has to be the one who cries foul when someone has too much and someone has too little, and someone has to take from the rich and give to the poor, and that someone becomes the ruling class, the government in that case. So now when you define it in all of those forms, I think you begin to see, yes, this is a political movement, but it's actually something much more than that.
Exactly, yeah. It's not just a political issue, but it's a deeply spiritual issue, and I would even say it's a spiritual principality. As
love it.
Marxism are principles that people adhere to, and they have taken hold in the spiritual realm of oppressor versus oppressed, and it is stood up to be anti-God. And so it is a principality that is at play that needs to be torn down by the voice of the church, by the voice of the truth that declares, no, there is a God. No, this is, people do have a right to ownership. People do have a right to pursue things with their life. They do have a right to own. Like that is base level stuff that we've covered and talked about here with the 10 Commandments. And
what's interesting is that when I was growing up again, if you watch cartoons or any movies, and they talked about the future was always brighter. As a child, I'm watching the Jetsons.
Nice.
So the Jetsons, they live in these these buildings that are up in space and they fly spaceships and they're wealthy and they're happy and things are going well. And you watch Star Trek and boy, the technology has improved and they're getting along well. And all of these were all positive images. Well, that began to turn. Star Trek began to even take its own little interesting turn. There's a whole discussion there about imagery inside Star Trek for another day. But as you get up into 90s and 2000s, you start seeing the future's not so bright anymore in movies. It's more of this dystopian darkness. Yeah. And what you often find is they have come to this place where there is this oppressive ruling class and everybody else is in this common socialist order. Yeah. And they all have in common, but there's this evil ruling class. That they somehow devolved into. But it's interesting that seems to be what people are crying out for today. That's what we want. All things in common. No more rich, no more poor, and no more unfair treatment. All that, it's like, what? So, political, but like you say, yes, this is much more spiritual than that. This is a spiritual belief rooted in faith or lack of faith.
Exactly.
And that has political implications to it.
I mean, again, it is anti-God, and I think like the chief goal of like the Marxist mentality is the idea of like, hey, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You'll own nothing. The government will own everything, and we'll just distribute it to you, or you can rent it from us, and you will be happy. Yeah. In fact, that's actually what the World Economic Forum has said ever since 2016. They say, hey, by 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. That's their goal. That's the goal for people, So to say, oh, hey, Marxism's not really here in America is to be ignorant, and it is to close your eyes to the truth. And so we want to open your eyes to the truth. Yeah. But again, like when God gave the 10 Commandments, they were, filled with the principles of the ideas of private ownership. The idea of thou shalt not steal means someone owns something and it's not yours. You don't get to have someone else come in and take it and give it to you, And
they weren't condemned for owning it.
Exactly.
They weren't condemned for having it.
No, it was theirs and they deserved it, And again, there were, with the 10 Commandments, is filled with principles for prosperity and individuals for freedom. Thou shalt not covet what your neighbor has. Doesn't matter how much they have. It is theirs, not yours.
What's interesting is the rest of those verses there about not coveting. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, his wife, his male servant, or I think it's his, I can't remember the other piece there, but the implication is obviously that guy has a lot more than I do. He's married. He's got a house. He's got property. Yeah. He has
people working for him.
He has people that work for him. He's an employer.
Yeah.
Wow, look at all that guy has. And God says, don't covet what he has.
Yeah.
Whew, don't desire that.
Yeah.
So it establishes all these principles for private ownership that is right, that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. And we're created to be free. And so to reject all of that, I think you move over into some spiritual components now. You have to reject that there is a God who creates you. There's a God who wants you to be happy. There's a God who gives you individual freedoms. You have to reject all of that and get to the idea like, well, you know what? Culture is pretty bad right now, and the best thing would be if someone would rise up, if there was a government that would rise up and just make sure that everybody had all in common, that would just really solve everything. That you have to dismiss a lot of biblical principles for that to come to play. And I know some people like to say, well, in the book of Acts, with the early church, what they did is they sold all things that they had, and they had all things in common. You read that in the book of Acts. They had all things in common, and no one had need, for they cared for one another. But what you find there is that no one told them they had to do that. They weren't forced to do that. It was voluntary. If you and some families go together and say, hey, we're going to care for one another's needs. You have what you have, I have what I have, but we're going to care for one another's needs. Who has a need right now? That's fine. That's great. But for someone to stand up and demand that everyone sell all they have and all things be owned in common, that's a different order. Yeah. You're violating the principles of freedom and individuality, and even you're defying the very commands of God in doing that.
Yeah.
And I think what we're finding today with the chaos that's in our streets is this push toward that. And you'll hear people say, America just they need to burn it to the ground and start all over. It's all broken. Defund the police, destroy the government, change the way we function.
Yeah. Rewrite history.
Rewrite history. Do away with the Electoral College. Do away with private ownership. Do away with the medical industry. Let the government provide medical care. All of that, it's a move toward this Marxism, socialism way of life. And what we're finding is the chaos in the streets are the result of that, because this way of life, this Marxism, is being taught in college classrooms. It's now being discussed in high schools. It's being fed out to media outlets. You find it encouraged in the way big business is structured even today. It's impacting every bit of who we are as a culture.
And what it has become is it is an inverse worship of the true God, and it has become worshiping man.
Wow.
So it is inverse worship as we were intended. You know, like everyone worships something, and what Marxism worships is what man can accomplish, what man has established, and there's no worship of God at all. So it's the inverse version of what we were made to do, of worship, sacrifice to, bring praises to God, and then in turn they say worship the government.
Wow.
And everything you do, say, or all goes to the government.
Yeah, I guess it's this idea that, God says the greatest commandment, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He's first. And then love your neighbor as yourself. But the inverse would be love your neighbor as yourself, but love yourself.
Yeah.
And there is no God. And man will be the one who determines. There is no God. He's not on the plan. And so we will love and we'll determine we will be like God. We will take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We'll determine what is best.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that this is not just a political issue. Yeah. This whole thing is an inverse worship, and it's not just political, it's deeply spiritual.